Hi, you're listening to the Christian and the Campus podcast. And today we're going to be talking about the Christian and critical thinking. And I'm excited to have, of all people, my sister, Anna Brinkerhoff, to talk about this topic with us because one of the things that college students encounter, whether they're Christian or not, when they enter a college campus is just a world of new ideas in which they're going to have to process and think about. And as Christians, we want to think about those with clarity. And I couldn't think of a better person to kind of talk about this topic with than my sister. So instead of me introducing her, since I have her here with us, I'm going to let her introduce herself.
Okay, well, my name is Anna, and I am a grad student. I'm working on my PhD in philosophy at Brown University in Rhode Island. I think about beliefs a lot. Specifically, I work in epistemology. That probably doesn't mean much to many people. But basically, I think about what we ought to believe, and more specifically about what's rational to believe. My job is to think critically. So I'm excited to talk about it.
Yeah. We've used the phrase or the two words together quite a bit so far, and that is critical thinking. And I just think it'd probably be helpful to maybe start off this conversation by defining what exactly do we mean when we say critical thinking.
Yeah, so I agree. I always tell my students when they're writing philosophy papers to define key terms at the start before jumping in. So I like this question up front. So I would say that critical thinking is roughly the intellectual process of evaluating your beliefs on their epistemic merits and demerits, or to put it in another kind of less jargony way, instead of accepting a claim as true just because it's the party line, because everyone around you accepts it, or because your parents or your minister says so, critically thinking about a claim involves weighing the reasons for thinking that claim is true or false, weighing the evidence, in other words. And that in turn can involve a number of things like identifying underlying assumptions, clarifying and analyzing relevant concepts, addressing objections to the claim, and also importantly, thinking about whether the claim in question is consistent with other claims that you already accept. So basically, critical thinking is just thinking well, right? Its goal is just to get to the truth of the matter, clarifying and stripping away any biases or emotions that might cloud our judgment. It might be helpful to give an example. Would that be helpful?
Yeah.
Example. So take the claim, a moral claim that euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide is morally permissible or impermissible. Critically evaluating that claim might involve identifying and evaluating assumptions about the role of doctors and figuring out the significance between the difference between letting die and killing someone, defining and analyzing the concepts of death and the concept of suffering, and maybe even coming up with an account of bodily self-determination or weighing considerations of bodily self-determination and against considerations of the sanctity of life. So that's just an example of what critical thinking looks like, for an everyday messy concept.
Yeah, and so for a student who's coming onto college campus and let's say they're a freshman, they come to college campus for the first time, they're going to be exposed to new ideas. They are going to have to, critical thinking is not really an option. You're going to have to, if you're exposed to new ideas, things are going to get a little messy. If you're going to have your presuppositions challenged, you can you can just not engage those, but for the most part, you're probably almost naturally going to do it. And so it's something we probably want to do well.
Right, exactly. Right. You could, right, especially on a college campus where you're surrounded by all these new ideas and all these people from different backgrounds, you're going to come across ideas that are new to you and that are inconsistent with beliefs that you have. One approach is just to ignore them and push them aside, but probably the better approach is to think about them, to critically evaluate them. And that's what a lot of us want to do. We like doing it. Some of us even find it fun, but also it's important for, I think, reasons we're going to get to later.
Yeah, and so just kind of after kind of having defined this term, critical thinking, and just if you're listening as a student, this is not something that is avoidable to you. I'll just put it this way, it's harder to avoid it almost than to engage it.
Well, right. And also, I mean, we do it every day, whether or not we realize it. I mean, we do it when we like evaluate politicians' arguments for why we should vote for them, or conversations at the dinner table about whatever, even in church. So it's something we do every day, and so we might as well do it well.
Yeah. And so I guess like if that's the case, right? It's something that we are almost just innately have to do as human beings. How would you describe current Christian culture's relationship with critical thinking, right? Are we doing it well, or are we not, or are we avoiding it, or,
Yeah, I mean, well, so critical thinking certainly isn't absent in churches. I mean, whether we realize it or not, many sermons, I'm sure many of the talks you give at RFC are basically an exercise of critical thinking, right? Like when preachers give you a practical or Bible-based reasons to give away a certain amount of your income to charity, or when they flesh out, give an account of what it looks like to love your neighbor well, trying to specify the obligations we have to our neighbors. That's basically critical thinking in action. So it's certainly not absent from our Christian communities. But I don't think that that's actually typically what comes to mind when we think about critical thinking in Christian circles. Typically what comes to mind, I think, is questioning core tenets of the Christian faith, right? Like the claim that God exists, or the claim that Jesus is God incarnate. And my impression is that it's common in Christian circles to kind of have a narrow, if not totally negative view of the value of that sort of critical thinking, right, when it comes to the core tenets. And the narrow view of its value is that critical thinking can be used in the service of Christian apologetics, in order to, defeat the village atheist, so to speak, to put the atheist in their rightful, intellectually inferior place. So I think that that's kind of a common view among Christian circles. And I just want to comment on that view real quick, if I can. So, I mean, I do think it's important for Christians to be able to respond to objections to the core tenets of Christianity. I do think there's something valuable in that. But I don't think that the intellectual arrogance that sometimes accompanies Christian apologetics is good or productive, or for that matter, Christ-like, right? Jesus is always meeting people where they're at. And for what it's worth, I've noticed that this sort of arrogance most prominently in like freshman philosophy majors, or people who read 2 Lee Strobel books and think they're experts. I don't see it as much among Christian philosophers, people like Alvin Plantinga, Mike Ray. They're some of the smartest people on the face of this earth, but also some of the most intellectually humble. So I think the best thing to do when we're thinking about Christian apologetics is to emulate people like them, and carefully engage with those who object to the core tenets of Christianity with an open mind and without the arrogance that too often accompanies it.
what are there any, so there's this posture of possible negativity towards critical thinking in Christian circles. Are there any other postures that are common, you think?
Any other postures that I think are common among Christian circles to critical thinking? I mean, I think one approach is just to ignore it, just to push it aside. So maybe that's neutral, it's useless, but not necessarily bad.
Yeah. I mean, so like that one is the one I think I feel like I encounter the most just in ministry is and this is not like, oh, it happens all the time. It's every student I encounter, but where it isn't something that's highly valued. Where Christianity is more about your emotions, taming them or trying to excite them so you get a certain feeling about God and you can have that positive feeling associated with God. And it just has very little to do with your cognitive faculties and your ability to think about and process and interpret and articulate kind of your experience around you.
Right. Which it should be pointed out is ironic, especially in our tradition, which emphasizes, we call ourselves believers, right? That's how we identify. We identify ourselves as believers. So that kind of approach, which is probably very common, is in tension with this other facet of our tradition that does emphasize beliefs and believing well.
Why do you think this is so, right? So if there's at least a minimum negativity or just kind of an apathy towards critical thinking in current Christian culture, why is that so? Why is it absent, at minimum absent, and at worst seen as negative? in the Christian life or culture?
Yeah, so I have a couple of speculations, I guess. When we're talking about critical thinking about the core tenets of Christianity, probably historically, one of the reasons that this sort of thinking wasn't very prevalent or seen as valuable was just because many of us tended to live in isolated or insulated, intellectually homogenous communities where everyone had similar religious beliefs, right? So when that's the case, when everyone has the same beliefs, there isn't much pressure or incentive to submit those beliefs to serious scrutiny. But of course, that's really the case today, especially if you're in a college community, right, where people from all different sorts of faith backgrounds are together and conversing. And when it comes to critical thinking about doctrinal issues, especially within our tradition, I think the absence of critical thinking can be explained because of something like this thought. Look, the Bible is clear. The Bible says X, so there's nothing else to do but to accept X, right? No critical thinking about X is needed. But I think that this line of thought kind of falls flat when we look around us and see the abundance of disagreements among good-hearted Christians about what doctrines, Scripture supposedly clearly supports. So my best guess is that today, one of the reasons that critical thinking is absent from at least some Christian circles, or viewed neutrally or not as valuable, it's just the way that we conceptualize faith. And here I'm drawing a lot from Greg Boyd, who's one of my favorite Christian thinkers of all time. He has a lot of good stuff on this. His impression, and I agree, is that there is a tendency to think of faith as intellectual certainty, right? The more confident you are in the core tenets of Christianity and the important Christian doctrines, the stronger your faith, and so the better Christian you are. And when we're operating off that kind of conception of faith as intellectual certainty, critical thinking becomes our enemy, right? Why? Because it invites doubts that can reduce our confidence in the core tenets and these important doctrines, which in turn threatens our faith and makes us worse Christians. So critical thinking should be avoided or viewed wearily or pushed aside. Ultimately, I think that's an anemic view of faith. And for an awesome discussion of why, again, I heartily encourage you to read some of Greg Boyd's work, especially he has a book called The Benefit of Doubt that's really, really nice, where he explains why this kind of intellectual certainty conception of faith isn't good or biblical, and it kind of offers another one in its place. And I don't want to go into the nitty gritty of Boyd's view, but I do want to emphasize something that I agree with Boyd on, which is that it's okay to have doubts. In fact, I think it's healthy to have doubts. What's not healthy is when you hide them or suppress them or set them aside or feel ashamed of them. It's far better to ask the tough questions about faith together and to share doubts with each other and talk about them in community, because that's the best way to think about things in general, right? With other people who are thoughtfully, respectfully approaching these big important things with you, to have people to bounce ideas off of and to push you to think better and deeper. And when we do that, doubts aren't our enemy. They're not something to be ashamed of, and critical thinking is our friend.
Yeah, and I think like when we either suppress or hide or just kind of avoid our doubts, we almost give them more power than if we tackle them head on.
Right.
And address the fact that we have them and accept the fact that we have them. We give them power that they don't deserve.
Yeah, that seems right to me. There's something to be scared of. And then we get all defensive when people have objections to our views, and that doesn't lead to productive or helpful conversation. So, right, it's not practically good in any way, shape, or form, I think.
Yeah. Well, so we kind of talked about the reality of kind of where kind of critical thinking is maybe possibly lacking inside of Christian circles. But I guess kind of maybe turning the page a little bit, what would you say can and should, or what role would you say can and should critical thinking play in the church and Christian life? And especially kind of thinking about on a college campus.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good question. So two roles come to mind off the top of my head. The first is the role that critical thinking can play when Christians engage with non-Christians. And then the second is the role that critical thinking can play when Christians engage with each other, with other Christians. So let's talk about the first role first, which is that critical thinking, I think, helps us thoughtfully and humbly engage with non-Christians and their objections that they may have to Christianity, which we've already kind of touched on. And this necessarily involves thinking critically about the core tenets of Christianity. For what it's worth, I know so many really, really smart people who are much smarter than me, many of my colleagues, in fact, who think that like the problem of evil is decisive against theism. They think that it's not rational to believe that an all-loving, all-powerful God exists, given the amount and type of suffering in the world. And this is a really tough problem for Christianity, and it is good for Christians to be able to engage thoughtfully and humbly with those who raise this sort of objection to Christianity, who of course we're going to run into people like this on college campuses. And the only way we can do this is through thinking critically about the problem of evil, which, by the way, some really awesome Christian philosophers have done already. Alvin Plantinga, for one, Eleanor Stump, Marilyn McCord Adams has some really, really nice stuff on the problem of evil. So that's one role I see for critical thinking, is kind of helping foster productive conversations between Christians and non-Christians. The second role is the role it plays, it can play between Christians when Christians disagree among themselves. Critical thinking can help arbitrate disagreements within Christian communities. I think we all know that Christians disagree with each other about a lot of things, and many times these things are important. So like gender roles, for example, about what the afterlife is like, about how to interpret scripture, how to interpret Romans 9, for example. And some of these disagreements are really important. For example, it matters a lot to the well-being of women, how we're treated within our church communities. And it seems to me that some of the competing views within Christian circles are bad views, right? They're not only false, but they're also pernicious, and acting on them leads to harm. So for one example from history, some Christians appealed to scripture to support slavery, while of course other Christians appealed to scripture to oppose slavery. And the best and perhaps the only fair way to figure out which competing views among Christians to accept is to critically think about them, right? To evaluate them on their merits, to weigh the evidence, to identify, any underlying assumptions about scriptural interpretation, or to investigate whether the view in question is compatible with what's revealed through Christ about love and morality. Right, I think that critical thinking about controversial matters, both doctrinal and core tenets of Christian faith, it's like vital, it's super vital for the health of Christian communities.
Yeah, so you've kind of talked about like a external level, an internal level inside the Christian community. But I think, and we kind of talked about this a little bit in a previous conversation, there's almost like a personal level too, that this is just really valuable, right? Because if you're engaging in critical thinking on those two levels, it's going to help you grow personally, right? You're just going to like almost intrinsically become a more thoughtful and better person if you're engaging in those activities. And like our parents mom still is in campus ministry, and like one of the phrases that we just heard them say growing up a lot is making your faith your own, right? And there's just like intrinsic value to that, right? If you engage in like critical thinking with those outside the Christian community, with those inside the Christian community, you personally are just going to become a deeper, more flourishing human being and Christian, right?
Yeah, and more stable, right? If you understand the reasons why you believe what you believe, objections to Christianity or people who disagree with you don't seem so threatening, right? And it fosters, deep spiritual understanding that promotes spiritual flourishing. Absolutely.
Yeah, and that kind of leads kind of to maybe the next question, unless you have anything else on this one.
No, that's all on that.
And that is just kind of what we almost started hitting on this, but why is critical thinking valuable to the Christian, and why is it valuable to the church, and how does it change and impact how we live out our everyday lives?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I'm taking you to ask about kind of the personal value of critical thinking for Christians. Why is it important for Christians to critically evaluate their Christian beliefs? And two reasons come to mind initially. And the first reason just has to do with the importance of these beliefs, right? Pretty much every Christian is going to agree that our beliefs about the core tenets of Christianity and some of our, some of the important doctrinal issues are some of our most important beliefs, right? Like the belief that God exists, that he's all good and powerful, that Jesus Christ is his son, that it's by virtue of him dying on the cross that we're atoned for. These are really important beliefs. These are the beliefs that we structure our lives around and that inform our self-conceptions and our relationships with those around us. And I think that in order to be intellectually responsible, right, in order to be good managers of our beliefs, it's generally good to evaluate our most important beliefs, assuming that we have enough time and resources. And that's because what we believe matters, right? And so if it matters what we believe, it matters how we manage our beliefs. And if it matters how we manage our beliefs, it seems that we should manage our most important beliefs with extra care. So since, if we all agree that the core tenets of Christianity and our beliefs about them are some of our most important beliefs, and since we, and by we, I mean, Western Christians, you happen to have the opportunity for college education, we typically have the time and resources to do so. And especially since these beliefs face widespread objections, it's good to critically evaluate them, all else being equal. So I think that's one reason.
Can I have a follow-up to that? Actually, could you give me maybe an example? You said the statement, our beliefs matter. There might be some people like, oh yeah, it matters, like on some level, but like, how does that matter practically? So like, how would you maybe respond to that question? Where it was like, maybe where you can maybe make that more tangible for someone.
Yeah, sure. So beliefs directly inform how we act. How we act is a combination of what we believe and what we desire. So, if I am thirsty and I believe that there is coffee in the coffee pot, that's going to lead me to get up and pour coffee in the coffee pot. If I believe that I ought to love my neighbors, and I also believe that loving my neighbors requires me to, donate a certain percentage of my income to charity, then that's going to lead me, supposing that I, desire to be a good person and do as morality requires, that's going to lead me to donate a certain number of my, certain percentage of my income to charity. So beliefs are important for at least the reason that they directly influence how we act. And I think we can all agree that how we act is important.
Yeah, that's helpful. I just thought there, just as people hear it, well, you're just playing around in the mind, and yeah, that kind of matters at some level, but it doesn't, how does that actually impact life? And those are helpful examples. And I know you could give a lot more of just how that actually plays out in everyday life, because it does, it matters greatly.
Yeah. Well, and also, if we think about even just the belief that God exists, right? If that turns out, I would hope at least that your life would be very different if you believed that God exists than if you didn't, or that you believed in the core tenets of Christianity and then if you didn't. So, right, it's not just like a fun intellectual exercise to think about these things.
Yeah, and the fact that we might treat it as one actually tells us more about how we practice our faith than it does about do beliefs matter, right?
Exactly.
And yeah, but and I kind of cut you off. You said there was kind of a second thing that you thought about why is critical thinking valuable to the Christian and the church, and how does it impact you?
Right. Yeah. So the second reason is based on this thing that Alvin Plantinga, who I mention him a lot because he's one of my favorite philosophers, something that he says that the Christian narrative, which he takes to be the story of creation, rebellion, incarnation, redemption, is not only the greatest story that's been told, it's the greatest story that could ever be told. It's the greatest possible story. And the great and good and beautiful ideas contained within that story are the best and greatest and most beautiful ideas in both the history and the future of the world. And I think that that's true. And I think that it's important that as Christians, we are able to properly understand the Christian story. And to be able to properly and fully grasp and understand it, we need to be somewhat theologically sophisticated, right? We need to critically evaluate not only the core tenets of Christianity and objections to them, but also Christian concepts like the Trinity and the Incarnation and divine personality and providence, right? We need to build up a sort of theological understanding through which we can see the Christian story. Because, having a robust theological understanding allows us to kind of hold the whole narrative, this whole story in our heads, right? To see all the moving parts and how the core tenets interact with interact with each other, and how all the paradigmatic Christian events connect up with each other, and how it all affects us, right? And how it's very much a story that's still in progress. And in addition to all that, in addition to, allowing us to appreciate the big picture, having a robust theological understanding puts us in an intellectual position to catch all the details too, right? To see the subtleties and the nuances of the story, which make it, that much more beautiful and great and exciting and fresh. So I think critically thinking about the core tenets of Christianity and core Christian concepts is an integral part in building up the theological understanding with which we need to fully appreciate and grasp the Christian story. And then by fully appreciating and grasping the Christian story, I think we can better understand the divine nature and the nature of Christ and pure love, which in turn puts us in a better position to emulate it, right? So right, I think that's the second main reason why I think it's theological understanding and by extension critical thinking about important Christian concepts and ideas is important. But I do want to, can I make a caveat real quick? Because I think especially those of us who have the luxury of a higher education, we tend to, and I'm at risk of this too, we tend to overemphasize the importance of like the intellect. And I think that, don't get me wrong, I do think that it's important, but I don't think that you have to be a good critical thinker in order to be a good Christ follower. And being a good Christ follower is what matters. I think that the Christian story can be adequately grasped by those who think in the plainest of ways, and in some ways, in some profound ways that I don't grasp. But I do think being a good critical thinker has its advantages, especially when you're in a position where you're encountering objections to Christian ideas all the time, when you're in a culture that fosters and prioritizes critical thinking. Being a good critical thinker can put you in a position to be a better Christ follower.
Yeah. So like basically, I think maybe to try to summarize some of what you're saying there is with that caveat, if God has put something good on the table for us to take, why would we ever turn it down?
Right. Exactly.
Right? And if critical thinking can help us, and we've been exposed to the tools that we need to develop those capacities and skills to do that, why would we turn down the ability to understand God's word better? Like, why would we ever turn that down if that has been given to us, right? It just, we don't want to cultivate the habit of rejecting a gift that God's given.
Right. Yeah, that seems exactly right.
And so and I think it's just like, one of the reasons why I really wanted to interview Anna on this topic is just because Anna does have that, she understands the importance of what she does as a philosopher, but she also understands its limitations. And so I really appreciate you saying that, because I think it means a lot coming from someone who is as thoughtful and as trained as you are, for just people to hear that. So, because I think that matters, because I'm definitely a victim of that as well. I guess, as we've kind of talked, there's almost kind of a dissonance kind of being created towards, we talked about, well, here's kind of the way critical thinking is thought about in churches, or maybe not thought about in churches, and what we're probably called to, and what's kind of on the table for us as Christians, and what we could do in terms of critical thinking. And so I guess my question is kind of moving forward, how do we remedy that dissonance between what we're called to as Christians when it comes to critical thinking and what we are currently kind of practicing in our culture?
Okay, so, right. I think it's a mistake to think that there's a tension between being a good Christian with strong faith and being a good critical thinker. Any attention that there is, I think, is merely apparent. It's illusory. It's a product of a mistaken conception of faith that's based on psychological certainty as well as certain contingent historical factors. So thinking critically, thinking well, does not undermine, if anything, strengthens faith. So go all in, right? Think hard, think well about the most important things, which includes many of our core Christian tenets and concepts. I think one of the things that comes to mind here is one of the lines in the mission statement of Pepperdine, which is my alma mater. I don't remember exactly the exact wording, but I think it's something like truth, having nothing to fear from investigation, must be pursued relentlessly across every discipline, or something like that. And I think the point there is that, critical thinking, investigation doesn't change or challenge what's true. It just reveals what's true. It helps us get to the truth. It helps us understand why things are the way they are. So if we Christians are confident that our core religious beliefs are true, then there's no risk in submitting them to critical evaluation. And if critical evaluation happens to suggest that they're not true, then surely that's not something we want to hide ourselves from. That's something we want to take into account and try to understand. So, right. My advice, my take is Christians should go all in on critical thinking. There's nothing to hide. There's nothing to be ashamed of. But there's a lot to be gained.
Yeah, like we of all people, as those who bear the name of the one who says, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life," should say, "Okay, great. Like, let's go for it. Like, let's subject ourselves to scrutiny and thinking clearly about this, because we believe Jesus. We take Jesus at his word that he is the way, the truth, and the life." Well, I guess just kind of like maybe to kind of wrap things up a little bit. Imagine a freshman at the great University of Mississippi. Imagine they grew up in a Christian home, and though they were not told that critical thinking was a negative, they weren't necessarily, maybe, as we were kind of talking about earlier, given a kind of clear role for critical thinking in their faith and the role that it should play. And you get, kind of to give that student some advice. What is one thing that they should do, and what is one thing that they shouldn't do? As if you get your one shot with this student, kind of what would you have to say to them?
Yeah, so I might be a little biased here given my career choice, but I would encourage them to take a philosophy class. Philosophy classes are they're not like the ones that are portrayed in that movie, God is Dead. I'm not sure if people have seen that, but that's not an accurate portrayal, I promise. Philosophy just teaches you how to think critically. It trains you how to evaluate arguments and to understand the reasons for and against controversial views, and to get at the heart of what someone is saying. And if a philosopher is doing her job correctly, she won't be trying to persuade you to adopt her views on philosophical matters. She's just going to try and get you to think about those issues on your own, and to take into account all the relevant considerations. So, right, my first piece of advice is to take philosophy class, learn how to think well, get trained.
Yeah. So, one tangential note on that, I took a philosophy class my sophomore year of college, it was my freshman year of college, and it was he was a Christian, right? I mean, I went to Auburn, a secular state university, but he happened to be a Christian. I probably grew more spiritually in that class than I did a lot of Bible classes I did growing up. I mean, it really just learning how to think clearly about different things and being exposed to different things. One of the reasons I knew he was a Christian is because he told me, I knew him from outside of the class, but as you said, he was just kind of helping you think clearly, and you grow a lot through that. Right. So yeah,
absolutely, right. And then once you learn how to think clearly and critically and evaluate arguments, you can turn that towards the things that you find in church. And I don't know, growing up, there were a lot of things that I had questions about in church. I remember being very bothered by the concept of hell, for example. That's the thing that really got me going. And I, by learning how to do philosophy, I was able to apply what, I learned about thinking critically and engaging in arguments and reading well, which includes reading scripture well, to come to a view that I think is good. And right. So, learn how to think well, learn how to think critically. You can do that by taking a philosophy class, and that's a good thing. And then think critically about, things that matter to you, including, core Christian tenets and doctrinal issues. What is one thing they shouldn't do? Well, you shouldn't watch God is Not Dead if you haven't already. But another thing is, don't think that you have it all figured out, because you don't. I know too many people who, after reading a book or taking a philosophy class, think that they have all the answers. You don't, I promise. This stuff is tough. And so it's good to be humble. It's good to be kind. Read a lot, read carefully, listen to understand before responding. Don't listen to react. I think, again, those are things that philosophy, when done well, can teach you to do. And I think it's just good. It's a good character virtue to foster listening and careful thinking and humility, which I think is too often lacking in Christian apologetics these days.
Yeah, and one thing I remember pretty vividly, it was while I was still living in Kentucky and we were talking on the phone. I remember you saying, arguments don't change people, people change people. And like, so if you are like more inclined to the critical thinking and that is something that you do value, like, don't forget that it's people that change people at the end of the day still, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. Right. I don't know very many people. Okay, that's false. There are some people who are change their minds engaging in arguments. But those people are few and far between. I don't think I'm even one of those people, to be honest with you, when it comes to certain core controversial matters. I think what arguments can do is show you that your position is defensible or not defensible. But I think most people change their minds by engaging with other people and coming to see things from a different perspective. And if you are mean and rude and arrogant, the people who are engaging with you are not going to want to be like you and are not going to be sympathetic to your view. So practically, it's good to be humble and kind. It's also morally good to be humble and kind. So be humble and kind.
It's probably a really good way to close it out. Thank you for being a part of it. Is there anything else you want to add, or you wrapped it up?
Nope, that's it.
Awesome. Well, Anna, thank you. And if you've gone all the way through this and listened to this, I just want to reiterate one of the resources Anna shared, and that is the Greg Boyd book. Do you mind sharing that one more time, Anna?
Yeah, it's Greg Boyd's The Benefit of Doubt.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you. And that is it.